All right, we're back with more metabolism. What could be more exciting than that? So this is the image that I showed you before I went over everything in the last one. So I kind of just want to reintroduce you to this. So glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose, again in the cytoplasm, you get some ATP, you get it quickly. If you have oxygen, then you get pyruvate. What this isn't showing you is that it doesn't show you the potential energy in the form of NADH, but that pyruvate, if there's oxygen present, will then go into the mitochondria, go into the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. They're the same thing. Remember what you'll get from that? You'll get CO2, you'll get some ATP, and then again, you'll get that potential energy in the form of NADH. Then all that NADH coming from glycolysis in the Krebs cycle will go into the electron transport system where you'll get a bunch more ATP. But in order for that to happen, remember, you have to have oxygen to accept those hydrogens from the NADH and the FADH2. Remember that if there's not oxygen present, then glycolysis will end, but instead of a pyruvate, it'll go one more step and you'll produce lactic acid. And that means that the production of energy kind of ends there. So you don't get a lot of energy, but you get it quickly, but you get that lactic acid buildup. And so you don't get, anaerobically, you don't get all of this. Okay. This is another picture of the same thing. Glycolysis, you get some ATP, you get this NADH up here. If you get pyruvic acid, if you have it aerobically, if there's oxygen present, then you get into the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. You get a little bit of ATP, you get more of this potential energy here, which then goes into the electron transport. Also remember though, from the Krebs cycle, you get that carbon dioxide. This electron transport then takes all this potential energy from here, uses it to make ATP, but in order to do that, you have to have oxygen present. Okay. You have to have oxygen present. And then you get that water, okay, water. Over here again, if there's no oxygen or not enough oxygen present, this doesn't go to pyruvic acid, it goes one more step to lactic acid, then it is anaerobic glycolysis, and you just get the ATP, but you don't get all of this and you lose potential energy. So here, if you go anaerobically, you end up with only a small amount of ATP for a molecule of glucose. If you go all the way through, then you get more ATP. And I won't ask you specific numbers, but know that if you go through aerobic glycolysis, that you get more ATP. Okay. What this also shows you is where fats and where proteins come in to produce energy using this system. So the glycerol from fatty acids, remember the glycerol, that fits into glycolysis here. In order for this to work though, you have to have glucose. So remember I told you fats can only burn in the presence of a glucose flame. And so in order for glycerol to fit into glycolysis here, you've got to have glucose. Okay. You'll also see fatty acids can fit into here. The fatty acids from the triglycerides will fit into the system here. But again, in order for this to happen, remember I also told you you had to have oxygen present to burn fatty acids. This won't happen from here on, won't happen without the presence of oxygen. So to get that energy from those fatty acids, you have to have oxygen present. You'll also notice amino acids fit into here. Now remember I told you it's not very efficient to burn protein. You really don't want to be doing that. But if you need to burn proteins, amino acids, they can fit into the system here at these different locations. Okay, at these different locations. So this is kind of showing you now how fats and how proteins can use the same system or fit into the same system in order to make ATP. Just a reminder that remember fats have a lot more carbon bonds than glucose does. So when you do get fatty acids and glycerol into the system, you get a lot more ATP than you do from a glucose. And I'll show you that in a second. So carbohydrate energy. It's the only fuel that can make energy anaerobically. You cannot make energy anaerobically from fats or from amino acids. It can work aerobically and anaerobically. The other fuels cannot. The other fuels can only work aerobically. For every 1 molecule glucose, I told you this earlier, goes all the way through aerobic metabolism, you get about 36 to 38 ATPs. That goes through aerobic metabolism. Remember, anaerobic's only going to be about 2. The brain, remember, can only use carbohydrates. We've talked about this several times. So it uses aerobic glycolysis. So in order for your neurons, your brain cells, to make ATP, they use oxygen aerobically and glucose. They need both of those. To get both of those, they need a blood supply. Remember, neurons cannot store glucose. So if you cut off the blood supply to neurons, they will almost instantaneously start to die, which is the side effects of a stroke. What happens when you have a stroke is you're cutting off blood supply, you're cutting off the storage for carbohydrates, and it cannot get oxygen. And so the neurons start to die, and that's where you get the symptoms of a stroke. So the brain, we've said this before, it's why blood glucose is controlled so tightly. We went through that already. Fat energy. You have a lot more calories of stored energy of fat as compared to carbohydrates. Remember, calories are energy, and kilocalories are the same, and we're going to talk about them interchangeably, are the same as calories. A lot more energy in fat stores. Okay. Again, because there are more bonds, more carbon bonds that can be broken, the more bonds you can break, the more energy you can produce. You must have oxygen in the cell to burn fat. Fat can only burn aerobically. So you have to have glucose and you have to have oxygen in order to burn fat. So if a triglyceride goes through aerobic metabolism, a glucose goes through it, you get 36 to 38 ATPs. A triglyceride, and this is an average because there's different triglycerides, you get 460 ATPs. So again, a lot more bonds, a lot more energy can be produced by fat. But you got to have oxygen and you got to have glucose. Okay. We've said this before also. The heart uses fat as a fuel. So the heart, like the brain, needs a constant supply of blood flow so you can get the oxygen there in order to use the fat to make energy. If you cut off that blood supply, in the case of a heart attack, the heart muscle is going to start to die relatively quickly and give you the symptoms of having a heart attack. This just shows you, this shows you what happens when you don't, and we'll do this more when we get to acid-base balance, but when you don't have, when your body is ready to burn fatty acids, but you don't have glucose, you get something that are called ketone bodies. This happens to people that are diabetic. What happens is they're not getting glucose into their cells. Their cells are ready to use fatty acids as a fuel to make ATP, but they don't have glucose because their insulin, they don't have the insulin. The glucose can't get in the cell. What will happen is they'll start to produce what are called ketone bodies. Ketone bodies can change the person's pH significantly, and you can get what's called metabolic acidosis, which is a common problem that you see in diabetics whose diabetes is not under control because their cells are not getting the glucose they need. Without glucose, they can't burn fat. When you get fat ready to be burned but can't be burned, you get ketones, and that can change your pH. It can also happen in a starvation kind of situation where they're not taking in glucose, or in a very low carb diet where they're not bringing in the glucose necessary to burn the fat. Protein energy, like I said, is not the way you want to be making energy. This just shows you, and I won't ask you specifics, but it's not very energy efficient. But it is a way when your body is desperate in order to get ATP to do its job, it can be used. Okay. All right, and just ignore these. So that is the end of metabolism. Again, go to the objectives and make sure you can answer the objective questions based on the video. This is actually the last video for your test over digestion and metabolism. Woohoo! All right, I will see you soon.